I believe, Francisco, we are on the air, and thanks everybody for joining the webinar. So, bem-vindo ao nosso webinar for Brazil, and we made a joke because I'm studying the Portuguese language, and we said next year we'll try to do it in Portuguese.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, but obrigado, Francisco, for having this with us. I'm a partner of Contea Global, and we are doing these webinars in Corona times a couple of times. And I was very pleased that Francisco said yes when I asked him if he could do something on Brazil. So that is very interesting because I think if you look at the discussions I had, mostly they say transfer pricing we do around the globe, but Brazil is a little bit different. And I think that is for certain aspect, but not, but it's I think not the total truth. Okay, and Francisco, maybe you can say something about yourself and about the company you work for.
Yes, yes. Thanks a lot to you. First of all, I have been seeing the efforts that Theo is making. We all hope that next year this webinar could be done in dual language, so in Portuguese and in English. Theo is a big enthusiast of Brazil. He even has his own apartment here, so he travels to Brazil a lot. So it's going to be very fun to see. But jokes apart, I must thank Theo for the invitation. It was very important for me to be able to explain to a foreign audience some of the Brazilian transfer pricing updates and how is moving our current ascension to the OECD process. Before we start, I work for Bocater. Bocater is a law firm in Brazil, and Bocater has completed 20 years last December. And we do all types of tax advice, tax consulting, and something that is really important in Brazil and not so much in other countries, which is Brazilian tax litigation as well. So our tax practice has been ranked in International Tax Review, Legal 500, all the major legal rankings. So our reputation, as Theo was mentioning, is very solid, and we hope we can be a viable solution for foreign companies getting into Brazil for do business there. Yeah. So thanks a lot for the introduction, Theo.
And may I add, there are a lot of advice in Brazil, but what you can do is really nice that you understand OECD and you really can build the bridge between OECD and Brazil, and that helps really to understand the overall situation, but also the details, because the devil is in the details somewhere. And therefore, I think next to you, nice guy, but there's also a very important aspect of our cooperation, and thank you for that. I think let's go into the agenda. Yeah. I think the agenda is built on 4 items. The alignment with OECD. It is that you see that the OECD has did a lot on consistency and transparency on the global side. You can say a lot about it, but that's really what happened there. And the question is how Brazil is reacting on it. So I think it's very interesting to see in that alignment to start with. How far is Brazil going? What's the process? What's the expectation? And that's always difficult, but that's, I think, very interesting. And then we go into an item that's often dealt with multinationals in the Netherlands, but a lot of other countries as well. They try to allocate their head office cost charges to all the countries, and often they have one problem, and that's the main one is often Brazil, because they have a problem with the withholding tax in Brazil, and then they take the hit in the head office. And the question is, can you do something about that? I think that's a very valid question here. Then we take some minutes, not too much, but I think interesting to know in the Brazilian tax reform. Yeah? And we will end with some takeaways and hopefully questions. So you can put questions into the system, then we see it, and we'll try to take them in the session, but maybe also in the end. That depends on where you can put the questions. But okay, let's go to the first topic. I think the alignment with the OECD. As I said, a lot of multinationals have tried to have a consistent process on TP, consistency. And there are some countries that have some problems with, but Brazil is often mentioned. And what they see is then they do allocate the costs of the company or the head office. And the part that should have been allocated to Brazil, they often take as non-deductible costs in the Netherlands, as an example. Another example is how you take the structures like the LRD structures we have. We will also talk about it. And so you have a lot of topics to cover. And maybe the first thing, Francisco, the context of the process. Can you say something about where Brazil is or is going to?
Yes, thanks a lot, Theo. Actually, the problem with Brazil is that Brazil has been for many years a very source-oriented country, and Brazil when designed its international tax policy was always thinking of an importer of not only goods, but also importer of technologies and services. So because of that, Brazil has always oriented his international tax policy towards the introduction of several withholding and additional taxations due on the importation, not only importation of goods, but as I said, of services and technologies. However, more recently, the process started under the term of President Michel Temer, and Brazil decided that as a policy, Brazil was going to apply to be a member of the OECD. This is a procedure that has taken place, let's say, for example, Brazil has introduced the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, in last 2008. So we are only 12 years from the introduction of IFRS here in Brazil. And this is interesting to see that Brazil is looking to become a more international country. And the ascension to the OECD is seen by the government officials as part of the process. I wanted to comment that Brazil has formally filed its request to join the OECD last 2017 on a letter which was signed by President Michel Temer. And at that moment, several items were pointed out as needed for evaluation in order to fully migrate and fully become an OECD member. And one of the items of the agenda was transfer pricing. At that moment, the Brazilian Receita Federal officials, they began to work in a joint program with some OECD transfer pricing officials. This program is led by Thomas Balco, who is the head of the transfer pricing unit of the OECD. And they have been working together with the Brazilian officials in order to understand the proximities and the points where those two systems collide, let's say. So at first place, they issued in July last year a first assessment of the differences between the two systems, and that report was issued and it was released through a conference in Brasilia last July, and a lot was discussed about the differences, and especially because of the Brazilian transfer pricing methods that they basically provide a fixed formula, a fixed profit margin or something like that, which deviate from the arm's length principle. And from the language of the first report, everyone thought that the Brazil would have to give away most of its principles in order to align. There was a big discussion about whether we could align partially or fully. And as a result, that report concluded that if Brazil was to adhere to the OECD principles, it had to be fully. So, but the problem is that the Brazilian officials were always mentioning that the difficulties we have here is also related to the management of personnel and the management of resources to fully evaluate and fully assess the economic structures of companies. Okay. So let's say always they mention that there is not enough technicians. They don't have enough technicians to fully understand, and maybe even English is a difficulty for most of the officials. So because of that, the Brazilian legislation has been designed to contain formulas that would make easier for reviewing and easier for evaluation. Yeah. And that's why we have, for example, our resale price method to test importation, which is basically the price of the importation and the local cost included to the cost of goods sold, and then you apply a profit margin that can range between 20, 30, and 40%. Okay. And to some sectors, that's very difficult to meet because of the nature of the product and the nature of the supply chain that is very complex, and that the market only allows a very low profit margin on top of that. It's also very important to mention that a conclusion of the report and a conclusion of the OECD when they were assessing the Brazilian system was that Brazil was basically taken away from the major worldwide supply chains. Brazil was only a part of the supply chain procedures when Brazil was either the supplier of the raw material, as we all know, Brazil is a big a big producer of natural resources, or when Brazil was the final destination of the goods. That's where Brazil would participate. Brazil was not like countries like its counterparts of China, Russia, or India, or even South Korea and Singapore. Those are countries that are much more aligned into the worldwide supply chain systems, and then they can receive products in order to make manufacturing and re-export to different countries. So Brazil has lost many of its economic competitivity, probably because of the transfer pricing legislation. Right, Theo?
Yeah, I think that's a true saying. So you're explaining that you try to align, but the other side you're explaining that you still have those lot of methods and formulas that makes the alignment a little bit difficult. And we had such a discussion on the LRD, limited risk distributors. In Europe, most world, limited risk distributor has limited risks, as the word says, and it has an activity that you can say that is less complex, and you can remunerate it arm's length on a range. It could be cost plus or percentage of sales, and then you have to be positive. Within that range, you are safe. When you're outside that range, then you have to explain, and it can be a risk. but we discussed that that all of these seems as a method that Brazil is looking at it. But if you look then at the formulas and the outcome, then it even a negative result could be also okay during to Brazil. That's for me sounds odd, but I think it has to do with your formulas, I think, and the system. Can you give some background on that, Francisco? Yeah.
Yes, Theo, absolutely. What we do have here is that for a very good example, the limited risk distributor structure, because if we look into the December report, the OECD officials, they were pointing out that Brazil was actually losing revenue because of its transfer pricing structure. And in situations like the limited risk distributor, as you said, worldwide throughout the OECD members, that limited risk distributor would have to leave a profit margin here in the country in order to cover for the activities that are performed in the country. But if we look to the Brazilian transfer pricing system, and especially our resale price method, if we get, because our methods, they are transactional methods. They basically test an individual transaction and individual item. We don't have, for example, mechanisms like the basket approach or a mechanism like the interquartile range or something like that. Okay. So we need to get each individual product that is imported and test the cost of goods sold plus a profit margin. So for example, a limited risk distributor in Brazil that invests in branding, opening of stores, and invests a lot of side costs related to the strengthening of the brand in the country. Those costs would normally be allocated towards the calculation of the profit margin in terms of the OECD methodology. But in Brazil, those costs could be left in the company as a loss of the Brazilian company. And normally they would have to be covered by the 20% profitability, but they are not. So okay. It's possible that we have a limited risk distributor in Brazil with a loss position.
And then you get a strange effect that you maybe can't charge the cost charges, but on the other side that you can leave cost in the country. And so that's really another way of thinking of maybe having a compensation between the two. That comes to my mind. That means that you can have tailor-made solutions for each company, because there is some non-deductible items. On the other side, you have possibilities that you can't think of. If you look at it from an OECD perspective, that's the reason that that bridge is so important, I think, Francisco. Yes. Maybe you can go on the consultation process and safe harbors. Can you say something about that?
Yes. What we have is that the whole consultation process is taking place nowadays. We have a procedure open. It started last July, and the OECD is receiving feedback from players, from policymakers, from lawyers and accountants in the country, in order to provide suggestions on how to improve our safe harbor system. It seems that they are looking into the Brazilian legislation and they are taking into consideration the limitations of personnel that we have, and also the number of medium-sized and small businesses that we have here. So probably the safe harbors, they may be kept to some extent, that they allow an expedited and facilitated audit of small and medium business companies in Brazil. So the biggest difficulty at this point, as I think, is how to align our safe harbors with the arm's length principle.
Yep,
so this is what we are going to see as an outcome probably of this consultation process that is going on at the OECD level.
Yeah. Is there some expectation on the timing and how, because it seems a very difficult angle, because you really have to re-evaluate your total methods and going from more transactional to an overall system, and that could, I think that will take a lot of time, but also a lot of thinking and calculation by the politician in Brazil, and we know that there is in Brazil not a very smooth development in the politics. It is really each time big changes in that situation. So it is difficult to predict, I think, how that is going. Yeah.
Yes, it's very difficult to predict how it's going to move. We can take, for example, Colombia. Colombia has I can say that in recent years, Colombia has had a more stable political system than Brazil. Mm-hmm. And it took them over 5 years since they requested and the final acceptance of Colombia. Okay. In our case, we have an alignment of President Bolsonaro and the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And he has, at least verbally and in some occasions, said that the US would support the Brazilian candidacy to the OECD. But there is a timing limitation that we need to take into consideration, okay, because that could be achieved. Brazil can review its whole system, but we can have Democratic President Joe Biden winning the next elections, and that could change the whole process. So it's very difficult to predict when and if Brazil is going to ascend. We currently have all the indications that it would happen, but it may take at least 2 to 3 years so we can have the whole process finalized.
Okay, but that's still quite timing is quick, I think. Yeah. Okay. Now maybe another point where we touched upon, and that's when you get audits, to get maybe certainty in advance and to make solutions if you have an adjustment. I think that's also a big topic for foreign multinationals if they go into Brazil. How is the audit situation there? Can I get some certainty in advance and a solution if I have double taxation? That's
yes, this is very important because the tax audits in Brazil, they rely a lot on our formulas and the methods. So it's very difficult for a company to have an arm's length result and still have to make an adjustment in Brazil. For example, we don't have in none of our double tax treaties, we don't have the paragraph 2nd of Article 9 that would allow a correlative adjustment.
Yeah. So
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So APAs and bilateral APAs and MAPs are difficult to, not possible, I think, in Brazil.
They are possible, but they seem to be very limited. Let's get the map example. Brazil has introduced legislation, so it's even possible to start a map from the Brazilian side. But because of Brazil's nature, it's very difficult to achieve results within the 5 years statutes of limitation. And the map process, as it is currently structured, it does not give a suspension of your rights to receive the tax credit or a suspension of the tax liability, like a regular administrative procedure would have in Brazil.
Okay.
So Brazil has introduced as a part of the BEPS action plans, especially BEPS action plan 14, I guess. Brazil has introduced MAP legislation, and we've heard that 2 or 3 maps have been started since then, both from the foreign country perspective, and one of them has reached a positive result, which was, from what I heard, a map with South Korea, in which the South Korean authorities basically accepted that the Brazilian formulas would be arm's length. So this is very problematic because I would always recommend a company to start a MAP procedure from its headquarters and not from Brazil, and then to have its own tax authorities advocate on its behalf when discussing with the Brazilian tax authorities, because as of today, we don't have certainty of how they are going to see an arm's length result if it deviates from the Brazilian formulas here in Brazil.
Okay, I think that was sufficient. I think for this this page. I think to summarize, I think OECD is going. Just going a little bit to the OECD, but if I heard the difference in systems, I think that will be quite a challenge. Okay.
Yes.
And so the timing, what you say, really is, I think, very, very demanding. So let's see how it will go. Okay. For me, it was very. For the first time when you explained the methods and the formulas how Brazilian works, I think that was an eye-opener to see where you are going into. And I think that's a very good takeaway. Another point we're now going into is more short-term, because this is on the list because we discussed it very many times, Francisco. Like
yes.
There's a lot of Dutch, but also other multinationals that don't charge Brazil because then they go into all kinds of taxation. So they take the hit in their own country, like say 25-30%, because then they avoid the same amount of withholding tax in Brazil, and then they say that we don't do it. But I think that is maybe not the answer to take the double taxation on the non-deductibility. Okay. And we discussed the McDonald's case and what's wrong with that. Can you give that maybe your view on it? Because you also discussed maybe the possible other approaches that maybe could work. Yeah.
Yes. Very important point, Theo, because there is a big misinterpretation of the whole head office's expense allocation in Brazil. We have to take into consideration the whole context that I mentioned, especially the problem with the Brazil being an importer of services and an importer of technology. This has to be taken into consideration because Brazil wants to protect its own labor and its own jobs. So Brazil is going to think as a policy, why is this company using accountancy from overseas if they could have a Brazilian accountant, for example? So when we see a Brazilian company trying to pay for head offices allocations, they have to think of the whole business group and why would it be an importation of service instead of head office whole cost that is being allocated. That's how the Brazilian tax authorities think, and taxpayers have been trying to change that policy, especially when we discuss, for example, that's within two Brazilian companies in Brazil, it doesn't make sense that I have one accountant for the company A and one accountant for company B, when the accountant for the whole group could make all the works and all the jobs, and then that cost could be allocated. This doctrine has evolved, and in the past few years, within Brazilian companies, the sharing of that cost has been accepted. And then we come to the international side of the solution, because we can have also a centralized department within the headquarters, and the necessity of sharing the costs of that department that works for the whole group. So the challenge here is to push away any risk of the Brazilian authorities thinking of it as an importation of service. And this was exactly the case with the McDonald's case. This is a case that came in the Brazilian Administrative Tribunal, and the Brazilian company, which is named Arcos Dourados, so Golden Arcs, they are the McDonald's affiliate, and they wanted to pay for costs, which are basically what we discussed: financial department, accounting department, and all departments that are within the headquarters and that they serve for the whole group. And those costs, they were shared within the whole McDonald's group, without a profit margin, without a markup.
Mm-hmm.
McDonald's did it all right, except that they were not lucky with the timing. If you look to what was discussed in their case, the authorities recognized that the payment for those costs took place without a markup, without a profitability. Only the cost that was reasonable, allocated within the Brazilian entity, was paid without the withholding tax. The problem is that, as I'm going to explain, even the Receita Federal has been issuing different approaches to this case. So Brazil was trying to pay for costs in 2012 and 2013 to countries like Argentina, the US, Uruguay, and the Netherlands also. And you can see that Argentina and the Netherlands, they have a double tax treaty with Brazil, and the US has not, and Uruguay at the time had not as well. So, and currently does not. So the issue here is not even a discussion of Article 7 or services, because it's not the case. It's actually the allocation of the head office's expenses, costs that are borne by the headquarters, but they need to be prorated within the whole group. If you look to the consultation solutions, the problem is that in 2012, we've had consultation solution number 8, in which they recognized that under cost contribution agreement, the Brazilian portion of the cost could be paid without the treatment of an importation of services. So if Brazil was contributing towards a common development, for example, a technology, they would accept those costs to be shared without the withholding tax, the PIS and COFINS, the CIDE, and the ISS, which are the 4 taxes that we have in the importation of services. Mm-hmm. But even taxpayers have mixed those concepts, and they have tried to allocate the head office's expenses under CCAs and other cost-sharing agreements. And that's where the Brazilian tax authorities got a little bit confused. And then they began saying that even in the case of CCAs, you would not have the ability to remit without the withholding tax. But as of today, the outcome of the McDonald's case was very interesting because it was tied. It was judged in December 2019. In May 2020, and that's why I say McDonald's was not lucky, because in May 2020, a new legislation came out in which every time there is a judgment in the administrative tribunal that is tied, it's going to be decided in favor of the taxpayer.
Okay. Francisco, what do you mean with tied? I mean there was no winner or loser? Yeah.
Yes. We have 8 judges, and it was 4-4.
Okay.
So it was a tie, and the tiebreaker is currently decided towards the taxpayers, but in December it was towards the tax authorities.
Okay. So now it would have been in favor of McDonald's if they would do the same at this moment, maybe the same outcome. Okay.
Yeah, okay. So it's very interesting to see that outcome.
Has it also to do because if you would have that outcome and say to the banks that there was a tie, but we tick all the boxes, we can. If the same would apply now, would have had the favor of the company itself, then still the banks, and that's maybe the next step, would then have the choice or maybe the obligation to do the withholding, because to my understanding, if the Brazilian company pays that charge to the Netherlands, and the bank still, although you had the position that they shouldn't do it from a court decision, they should still be the ones that decide to do or not to do the withholding, because they have the obligation, the banks, to do
it. Yes. This is a very important point because of the whole different interpretation of the tax authorities. The Brazilian Central Bank has decided to, and actually it is a rule of the Receita Federal also, that in terms of remittances, the payor agent is going to be jointly liable for the tax liability in terms of the income withholding tax. It's not all the taxes, but the income withholding tax, because it is due at the moment of the payment or the credit. So when a company is reaching out to the bank and saying, I have this invoice, it is my portion of the head office's expenses allocation, it was properly calculated and calculated according to a contract, I need to pay without the withholding tax, and the bank is going to say, no, I didn't review it. It is very difficult for me to accept that, and the risk is much higher than the benefit. So I cannot make this remittance without the income withholding tax. So it's very difficult even for clients to accept that outcome, because the bank can easily be sitting in his chair and say, I cannot do it because my responsibility is much higher. So I always recommend one of the 2 options. You can always use the bank of your relationship. So if it's a worldwide bank, a bank that has branches within the head office and also in Brazil, to maybe try through the relationship, the global relationship, to use that agreement as a trust within the Brazilian entity, and that the Brazilian entity would settle the tax liability if there was a tax assessment, or a lawsuit could be filed in order to obtain a court order that would allow you to make the remittance without the withholding tax. So as you can see, it is still very difficult to make it. We always find it difficult to convince the bank, and that's where the biggest problem arise.
Okay.
So this is something that the companies need to take into consideration.
I understand that because, but I was in Colombia a year ago, and then they discussed the going to the OECD. Yeah, like you said, it took 5 years, but also they discussed this kind of items, and also the possible use of the CCAs, the cost contribution agreement, where you, and this is how it is done there, really share the cost. You bundle the cost. That could be in Colombia, one of the countries, where all the costs are shared, and only the surplus, because it is a surplus isn't shared amongst the countries, so that you only have that discussion on the surplus and not on the total. It's like a clearinghouse. And
yes.
that also, and it was in Colombia seen as a new development. In Europe, CCA like that is also in the Netherlands for a lot of years already existing and accepted. But when I hear you, then and there's also Brazil going into the OECD and also the Thai there, and you can say that there are solutions, I think, potential solutions for your charges to Brazil. So this could be for company maybe a point of change where you say till now we have had non-deductible costs in, like say, in the Netherlands. And this could be an option to say I'm going into Brazil with the cost charge, and that's it. And then see if we can have it a bank that support us in the whole situation. So that
Yes.
it would be really a potential opportunity here. And obvious it's not without a risk and a cost. But if you then compare it to the coming years, almost each time a non-deductible item, that it could be a step to take at the moment.
Yeah, it is risky. It is risky. You could receive a tax assessment, but as you could see in the McDonald's case, there was a tie, and basically because the Brazilian Administrative Tribunal is made of joint composition. Half of the judges are appointed by taxpayers, and half are appointed by tax authorities. And in this case, there was a tie. So because of the tie, the tiebreaker at the time was decided in favor of the tax authorities. So you can see how it is always a roller coaster. It is not easy, but I see many headquarters with lots and lots of costs that should have been allocated to Brazil, and they end up with the worst case scenario because they have an undeductible cost at the headquarters, and a Brazilian company may be profitable that could receive those costs. So this is very important to take into consideration. Maybe if you could have if you could have, for example, somehow you could use the income withholding tax as a credit in the headquarters, and that payments made in Brazil could be used as a credit at the headquarters level. That could reduce the whole liability.
Okay, I've got two questions at the moment, Francisco. There was a question about McDonald's Arcos Dorados decision. They say, is it a final decision, or it was just the first instance decision, the McDonald's case?
Yes, very, very good comments. It was not the final decision. It is because we have a double layer in our administrative tribunals. It was not a final decision. McDonald's is still able to appeal on the administrative level. We never know if, as an administrative discussion, if the appeal is going to be accepted. But McDonald's still has a chance to overcome that decision. But as I said, if the decision was taken today, for example, McDonald's would have won. So that's how interesting it is.
Okay. And maybe a second question, but I think you already answered it a little bit. The court in some countries, a judge is always helping the tax authorities, and in some cases you see that they are more objective. Could you say something about Brazil? If I go to court, what I have to expect? Because that can be, and maybe it's not on all regions the same. I don't know. No?
No, actually, we can do the profile of most judges in Brazil. Some of them, they understand tax law, and they normally decide on a technical manner. But in most of the cases, especially in our federal courts, it's very difficult to make them understand very technical concepts. So it's easier for them to decide in favor of the tax authorities, and the discussion probably ends up in the Superior Tribunal of Justice or the Supreme Court. And at those levels, I see the legal discussions being decided within the Superior Tribunal of Justice, and there you can get more technical decisions. And currently, especially during the whole pandemic situation, the Brazilian Supreme Court is having virtual judgments. And in those virtual judgments, it's been a nightmare. Taxpayers are losing most of the discussions, and it's been very problematic.
Okay.
So, but I can say it's like you can get very good decisions at the judicial courts, yes, and in most of the cases you're going to get a technical decision at some point, either at the first level or the second level.
That's good to hear. I think for time's sake, I think we can discuss a lot on CCAs, but I think we covered a little bit of ground already. We maybe can go into the next slide, and that's maybe on the snapshots of the Brazilian tax reform, because to my understanding, there's a tax reform coming on, and with some interesting features, and maybe you can say a couple of minutes something about it.
Yeah. Yes. Everyone, and I guess everyone in the audience has dealt with Brazil, currently deals with Brazil, or has dealt with Brazil in the past. And we all know that Brazil loves to create new taxes, and that's a problem of our federal system, because we give tax autonomy with certain limitations to the municipalities, to the states, and to the federal government. And even at some points, there can be a conflict between state tax and municipal tax, like we have, for example, in the importation of software, where currently both cities, the municipalities, and the states can say that it's going to be either the ICMS or the ISS. Let's remember that we have in average, we have the ICMS, which is a state levy tax on the circulation of goods and telecommunications and electricity. So and oil and gas products as well. The problem is that in some points, well, going back to my explanation, we have the service tax, which is a municipal tax, and it's due on the payment of services. We have the PIS and COFINS, which are revenue taxes, but they can also be due on the importation. We have the IPI, which is an excise tax. We have the import tax. We have several taxes in Brazil that can be due on several steps of the production and supply chain. We currently have two constitutional amendments under discussion. Actually, we have PEC 45 and PEC 110, and they both are trying to make a joint, an amalgamation of these several taxes that I mentioned. The biggest problem is that you can have an amalgamation, but you would remove taxing powers from the states and the municipalities. Yeah. Even though the politicians, they are giving warranties to the cities and to the states that they would not lose revenue, it is very difficult to see they releasing their taxing power so easily. So this is a difficulty of the reform.
Yeah.
We are also having a possible return of the taxation of dividends in Brazil. Until 1995, Brazil had a dividend withholding tax of 15% in most situations. And at that time, Brazil decided that it wanted to attract foreign investments. And basically, Brazil reduced the dividend withholding tax to zero in all situations, regardless of the beneficiary. If it was a Brazilian beneficiary, a foreign one, or even a tax haven beneficiary. So as of right now, Brazil has a corporate income tax rate of 34%. And the discussion is that we could have a reduction of the corporate income tax rate to a level closer to the OECD average, which would be 20-25%, and the reintroduction of a dividend withholding tax. And this is very important for foreign companies making investments in Brazil, because they need to review their structures to see if a dividend withholding tax would be a sunk cost or if it could be used elsewhere.
So for planning, I think, Francisco, for planning's sake, it's good to follow this, because if you have now a dividend payment, then it's nil, and could be after reform that you're paying on it. That could be a very interesting topic to see into. And also what you explained, the first point, was that maybe the introduction of an European type of VAT. Is that what you were going to? And
yeah, thanks a lot, Theo. I wasn't clear enough. The discussion is about the creation of a new tax, which would be named IBS, and would function very similar to the European VAT, which is basically a full creditable, non-cumulative VAT. That's our goal as of today. There are several side discussions of, for example, we are discussing the taxation of books, because as of today, our constitution forbids, and in a full VAT system like the European one, it doesn't make any difference to tax books. So we are discussing that now, and for example, we are discussing if payroll costs would give rise to credits of the VAT of our IBS and stuff like that. So it's very interesting to see the outcome. But as you said, it's a movement that would make Brazil even more closer to the OECD practices as well.
Okay. And then I think the third part, that is the electronic payment tax, is something that you see more and more. Huh?
Yes.
The digitalization of the economy and digital becoming, and you see the money there. That's something Brazil is also looking at. Yeah.
They are naming it a digital tax. Let's not confuse with the digital services tax, but it's a digital tax in terms of when you make electronic wire transfers between accounts. In the past, we had the CPMF, which would be levied at 0.38% on the amount of the bank transfer.
Okay.
And they said it was that tax had a very harmful damage to the economy because people were keeping money at home or even paying everything in cash.
Yeah.
But the problem is that this is a very easy, because Brazil has a very strong electronic banking system. So it's very easy to enforce a tax like that. And if you have 0.1 or 0.2% of a small tax eaten from your bank transfer, most individuals do not see that happening, and they are going to say, yeah, whatever. So it's very easy to enforce. I'm against that because in the long term, you see your wealth being eroded because of the tax. But that's something we need to take into consideration as well.
Okay. Okay, I have a question, a couple of questions again. Also, one same nice event. Thank you for that remark. It's good coming in. I think for time's sake, let's go to the maybe to the last slide. Then I will come to the last question coming in. But maybe as first the takeaways. I think it is rightly so that. I forgot one question of tax reform, Francisco. When that is, what's the timing of it? Is that this year or next year?
The political actors are extremely engaged on the tax reform. So I can say that there are chances that we could have the reform approved before December. And most of the changes could be effective as early as January next year.
Okay.
So we really need to be following that closely, especially headquarters that deal with Brazil a lot.
Okay, I understand that. Okay. Sorry for the for that last question, because I thought that's also important, because it seems that it's coming on next year or the year after, but it could be hitting you hard already beginning next year. Okay.